In early 1944, before the tides of war turned in Western Europe, the battlefields of France, Italy, and the Eastern Front thundered under the weight of armored giants. Across the shattered countryside, the clash of metal against metal defined the struggle for dominance in mechanized warfare. Yet, amid this brutal contest, one truth echoed through the ranks of the Allied armored divisions: the American M4 Sherman tank, though reliable and numerous, was hopelessly outgunned. The Sherman, America's workhorse of war, had rolled triumphantly through North Africa and Sicily, its dependable engine and adaptable design earning the respect of crews and commanders alike. But as the war advanced into 1944, the battlefield itself had changed. The German Wehrmacht had unleashed new predators, the Panther and the Tiger, these steel behemoths, with sloped armor and devastating 75mm and 88mm cannons, rendered the once proud Sherman vulnerable and obsolete almost overnight. Tank crews across the Western Front felt this grim reality firsthand. Lieutenant Clarence Moyer of the 3rd Armored Division recalled, "You could hit a Panther straight in the front, and it would just bounce off. You felt like you were shooting pebbles at a wall." His words, preserved in post-war interviews, carried the weight of countless encounters where bravery met technological inferiority. The Panther, or Panzerkampfwagen V, represented a leap in German armored design. Its 80mm sloped frontal armor deflected most incoming fire, while its high-velocity 75mm KWK-42 gun could pierce a Sherman at over 1,000 yards. The heavier Tiger I, armed with the legendary 88mm KWK-36, was even deadlier, capable of destroying Allied tanks before they ever came into range. Too many Allied crews facing these machines was not just a tactical challenge, it was a sentence. Reports from the European Theater of Operations in early 1940 paint a grim picture. In Italy, Sherman units supporting the advance toward Rome encountered German armor in rugged terrain, where maneuverability was limited. The Sherman's 75mm M3 gun, effective against earlier Panzer models, now failed to penetrate even the side armor of the Panther. After-action reports from the U.S. 1st Armored Division detailed numerous engagements where entire platoons were lost before they could even return effective fire. For the tankers themselves, survival often depended on wit, speed, and sheer luck. Crews learned to flank the heavier German tanks, aiming for their thinner side and rear armor. It became an unspoken rule of survival: shoot first, shoot fast, and do not miss, but the cost was high. Each maneuver placed men and machines in peril, and many never came back. By mid-1944, morale among tank units began to waver. Letters sent home from France tell of soldiers' frustration. One commander wrote, "We have courage, but courage is not armor. When we see a Tiger ahead, we know our best chance is prayer." The contrast between American industrial abundance and the lethal precision of German engineering became painfully clear. The Allies had quantity, but the Germans held quality, a dangerous imbalance in the brutal calculus of war. Behind the lines, senior commanders took notice. General Omar Bradley, commanding the U.S. 12th Army Group, was among those who recognized the urgency of the problem. In his reports to the War Department, he stressed that the Sherman's armament was inadequate for the armored duels now defining the European campaign. Even the British, who had developed the powerful 17-pounder gun for their Firefly variant of the Sherman, struggled to field it in sufficient numbers. The Allied strategy relied heavily on the Sherman's versatility, its ability to be produced quickly, repaired easily, and adapted to multiple roles. Yet every advantage seemed hollow when faced with the unyielding armor of a German Panther. American tankers began referring to their machines grimly as Ronsons, after the cigarette lighter brand whose slogan boasted, "Lights every time." It was Gallo's humor born of experience, a coping mechanism in a war where steel and fire decided fate in seconds. Amid these challenges, stories of extraordinary courage emerged. At the Battle of Cisterna, near Anzio in February 1944, a Sherman crew under heavy fire continued their attack after 3 hits disabled their turret traverse system. Operating manually, they destroyed to enemy positions before retreating under smoke. Acts like these became symbols of defiance, proof that even an underpowered tank could prevail when driven by determination and teamwork. Still, the imbalance could not be ignored. Reports from the Ordnance Department and battlefield engineers consistently called for a new weapon, a round that could restore parity. Field experiments were conducted using modified armor-piercing shells, but most failed to achieve the desired penetration against modern German armor. Metallurgists in U.S. research facilities studied captured Panther armor plates, analyzing their composition and slope geometry to understand why standard ammunition was ineffective. The results were conclusive. The M4 standard 75mm armor-piercing rounds, even the improved APCBC armor-piercing capped ballistic cap variants, simply lacked the velocity and hardness required to punch through the Panther's glacis plate. At 500 yards, a Sherman's shell would flatten against the steel. At 100 yards, it might only leave a dent. By the spring of 1944, the Ordnance Department began exploring alternatives. A promising idea circulated among American engineers. Instead of relying on traditional steel cores, use an exotic material, tungsten carbide, known for its extreme hardness and density. This concept, though technically challenging, held the potential to transform the Sherman's gun from a blunt instrument into a precision weapon. Meanwhile, on the front lines, the cost of delay was counted in lives. Every encounter with the enemy's heavy armor reinforced the need for change. U.S. Army intelligence bulletins circulated diagrams of German tanks, marking weak spots in red ink. Training films instructed crews to aim for tracks, optics, and rear panels, anything that could disable or blind the enemy long enough to escape. It was a desperate measure in an increasingly technological war. As Allied forces prepared for the invasion of Normandy, commanders understood that armor would play a decisive role. The Shermans would form the backbone of the armored divisions pushing inland and from the beaches. Yet within the ranks, many soldiers feared that their tanks were already obsolete before the first shot of Operation Overlord was fired. The German Panthers, newly issued to panzer divisions in France, awaited them in ambush positions across hedgerows and villages. June 6, 1944, D-Day. As the landing craft hit the beaches and the first waves of armor rolled ashore, the battle-tested M4 Sherman once again became the spearhead of the Allied advance. Its engines roared across the fields of Normandy, its crews filled with determination and dread. In those first weeks, the fears of many were confirmed. Engagement after engagement demonstrated the same cruel truth. The Sherman could not match the Panther or the Tiger in a straight fight. Yet, from this crucible of disadvantage, the spark of innovation was born. In laboratories and workshops far from the front, a quiet revolution was already underway, one that would give the Sherman a new weapon and, with it, a fighting chance. The story of the M93 high-velocity armor-piercing round was about to begin, and with it, the transformation of the Sherman tank from underdog to predator. The war was changing, and so too would the tools of survival. In the summer of 1944, while the battlefields of Normandy roared with artillery and smoke, another kind of war was raging behind closed laboratory doors and factory walls across the United States. This was the war of metallurgy, chemistry, and engineering, a desperate race against time to give American tank crews a weapon capable of piercing the armor that had haunted them since the first Panthers appeared in France. The Sherman tank was never meant to duel with the heavyweights of the German army. Designed in 1941, it was a medium tank built for speed, reliability, and ease of production. Its 75mm gun could knock out early Panzer Es and IVS, but against the Panther and Tiger it was nearly useless from the front. The Ordnance Department knew it, the crews knew it, and by 1944, so did the enemy. German tank commanders began exploiting that advantage, turning every engagement into a deadly contest of range and precision. Within the halls of the U.S. Army Ordnance Department in Washington and the proving grounds at Aberdeen, Maryland, engineers faced an enormous challenge: how to defeat German armor without replacing the entire Sherman fleet. Replacing the tank was impossible. There were tens of thousands in service across Europe and the Pacific. What the Allies needed was a new kind of ammunition, one that could make the old gun fight like a new one. The answer would come in the form of an experimental concept, the high-velocity armor-piercing round, later designated the M93 HVAP. Its core idea was elegantly simple yet technologically radical. Instead of relying solely on steel, the round would use a tungsten carbide penetrator, a small but extremely dense core capable of maintaining velocity and shape even after striking thick armor. Surrounding this core was a lightweight aluminum body, allowing higher muzzle velocity when fired. The result was a projectile that traveled faster and hit harder than any standard shell of its size. The science behind it was sound, but implementation was another story. Tungsten carbide was a rare and precious material critical for industrial machining and cutting tools. The War Production Board already controlled its distribution tightly. Using it for ammunition would require not only new manufacturing techniques, but also a reallocation of strategic resources, a decision that demanded high-level approval from Washington. At Aberdeen Proving Ground, tests began in early 1944. Engineers fired prototype HVAP rounds at captured German tanks, Panther hulls and Tiger turrets brought over from European battlefields. The results were astonishing. At close to 2,800 feet per second, the tungsten core punched clean through armor that had previously been impervious. For the first time, a 76mm gun on a Sherman could penetrate the front of a Panther at medium range. Reports from Aberdeen described the moment as a technical breakthrough in anti-armor warfare. However, the victory in the test range did not immediately translate to success in production. Tungsten was scarce, and so was time. The US had limited access to the world's tungsten supply, much of it sourced from China and Burma. Transporting it during wartime across submarine-infested waters was an enormous risk. The Ordnance Department and the War Production Board had to weigh the benefits of producing HVAP rounds against the demands of aircraft tools, artillery manufacturing, and precision machinery, all of which also depended on tungsten. Meanwhile, the frontline situation grew more urgent. Reports from Normandy continued to highlight the Sherman's vulnerability. The 2nd Armored Division's encounters with Panther tanks near St. Late were particularly sobering. Out of 23 Shermans engaged, 14 were destroyed before closing to effective range. One after-action report noted grimly that our tanks are being knocked out at ranges beyond which we can reply. These reports reached ordnance officials and added pressure to accelerate HVAP development. By mid-1944, production contracts were issued to major U.S. manufacturers, including the Chrysler Corporation, which operated the Detroit Arsenal, and the General Electric Company, which provided precision machining for the tungsten cores. The new ammunition was officially designated as the armor-piercing, composite rigid M93. Each round was a marvel of wartime engineering, a small, shining symbol of the industrial and scientific power that the United States had come to represent. The engineers faced another problem: distribution. Even as the first HVAP rounds rolled off production lines, they could not be supplied in large numbers. Priority went to the units most likely to face German armor, primarily the armored divisions of the 1st and 3rd Armies in France. Each tank crew was typically issued only a handful of HVAP rounds, often as few as 5 per tank. They were to be used sparingly and only when absolutely necessary. In field workshops and depots, word spread quickly. Crews who received the new ammunition treated it like treasure. Reports from the 4th Armored Division described tank commanders locking their HVAP rounds in steel boxes to prevent theft. Soldiers compared notes on performance, sharing stories of how the new shell could punch a hole clean through a Panther like paper. But in war, innovation does not exist in a vacuum. The German side was not idle. Intelligence reports indicated that the Wehrmacht had also been experimenting with tungsten-cored ammunition, such as the PZGR point for APC or armor-piercing composite rigid rounds. Yet their supply was even more limited than that of the Americans. Germany's access to tungsten had been sharply curtailed by Allied naval blockades and the loss of trade routes to Spain and Portugal. In many ways, both sides were racing to make the most of a vanishing resource. Back in the United States, the industrial struggle to mass-produce HVAP ammunition revealed the complexities of wartime logistics. Factory workers labored around the clock. Metallurgists experimented with refining tungsten carbide to reduce brittleness. The result was a series of incremental improvements, each batch more consistent, each core more reliable. The rounds were tested against multiple armor types, homogeneous steel, face-hardened plate, and even sloped configurations designed to mimic the Panther's front glacis. Each test provided new data, which fed back into production refinements. By late August 1944, enough rounds had been shipped to Europe for the first widespread combat use. The U.S. Third Army under General George S. Patton, moving rapidly across France, became one of the first to receive them. Patton himself, ever a champion of armored warfare, reportedly described the new ammunition as the equalizer. His staff officers recorded in operational notes that the HVAP is to be distributed to tanks equipped with the 76mm gun and employed at discretion against heavy German armor. The stage was set for a showdown that would test not only the new technology, but also the courage and skill of the men who wielded it. Tankers who had spent months feeling inferior in combat suddenly had a new weapon, one that promised a fair fight. Confidence began to spread through the ranks. It was more than just a bullet. It was hope forged in tungsten and steel. Behind this achievement was a network of scientists and engineers whose names are often forgotten in the larger narrative of the war. Figures like Colonel Gladian M. Barnes, head of the Ordnance Department's Research and Development Division, played pivotal roles. Barnes had championed innovation throughout the war, from the development of the bazooka to the high-velocity 90mm gun. Under his guidance, the HVAP project received the push it needed to move from prototype to battlefield weapon. In technical manuals, the M93 HVAP was described with precision, a subcaliber, armor-piercing projectile featuring a tungsten carbide core enclosed in a lightweight aluminum body with a steel armor-piercing cap and ballistic windscreen. Its muzzle velocity was an impressive 3,400 feet per second, nearly 20% higher than standard rounds. In field conditions, that difference meant life or death. But the true test would come not on the proving grounds, but on the battlefields of Lorraine and Alsace. There, amid the rolling hills and morning fog, the Sherman's new weapon would meet its enemy in one of the most decisive armored engagements of the Western Front, the Battle of Arracourt. The tank crews who had endured months of fear and frustration were about to fight back with a vengeance. The M93 HVAP round had been born out of desperation, refined by science, and delivered by the immense industrial power of the United States. Now, in the autumn of 1944, it was time to see if it could turn the tide of armored warfare. In September 1944, the rolling farmlands of Lorraine, France, became the crucible of a transformation in armored warfare. The Battle of Arracourt, fought between September 18th and September 29th, would prove to be one of the most remarkable armored clashes of the Second World War, not merely for its scale, but for what it symbolized. Here, for the first time, American Sherman crews would meet German Panther tanks on something close to equal terms. The reason was the arrival of the M93 high-velocity armor-piercing round, the weapon that turned fear into firepower. The summer had seen rapid Allied advances following the breakout from Normandy. General George S. Patton's Third Army raced across France, outpacing its supply lines and stretching German defenses then, yet the Wehrmacht was far from defeated. In early September, the German 5th Panzer Army, commanded by General Hasso von Manteuffel, prepared a counterattack designed to cut off Patton's spearheads and regain the initiative. The target, the region around Arracourt, a cluster of small villages surrounded by fog-covered fields and low ridges, terrain that would soon become a graveyard for tanks. Facing them was the U.S. 4th Armored Division under Major General John S. Wood, a veteran formation whose tank crews were hardened by months of combat. Among its ranks was the 37th Tank Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, a name that would later become synonymous with American armor. Abrams's men, armed primarily with M4A3 Sherman tanks, knew they were outgunned by the German Panthers, but they also knew something the enemy did not. They now carried the new M93 HVAP ammunition. On the morning of September 19th, the battle began under a thick blanket of fog. German Panthers from the 111th and 113th Panzer Brigades advanced confidently, expecting to crush what they assumed were retreating American units. The fog, however, concealed not a retreat but an ambush. As the 1st Panthers rolled over a ridge near Lezy, Sherman tanks hidden behind haystacks and hedgerows opened fire. The result stunned both sides. For the first time, American rounds punched through Panther armor at ranges previously unthinkable. The M93 VAB shell left the Sherman's 76mm barrel at over 3,400 feet per second, striking with such force that it tore through frontal armor at 600 yards and side armor at twice that distance. The tungsten core, small but deadly, did not shatter like earlier projectiles. Instead, it sliced through steel with surgical precision, igniting ammunition racks and fuel stores inside German tanks. Witnesses described Panthers erupting in bursts of orange flame, their hatches flying open as crews scrambled to escape. Tank Commander Sergeant Lafayette Poole, one of the most decorated American tankers of the war, later recalled the difference the new ammunition made. Before, you would hit a Panther 3 times and it would laugh at you. Now, one shot in the right place and it went up like a torch. His crew, like many others, learned quickly that the M93 HVAP gave them something they had not felt in months: confidence. Arracourt became a duel of skill and nerve. The Germans had superior optics, heavier guns, and thicker armor, but the Americans had mobility, communication, and now an equalizer in the HVAP round. U.S. tankers used the terrain masterfully, taking advantage of the morning fog and rolling hills to strike first. Air reconnaissance and radio coordination with artillery allowed Abrams's battalion to maneuver faster than the slower, heavier Panthers. Each engagement became a deadly dance of steel, smoke, and sudden violence. By the second day of battle, the 4th Armored Division had destroyed more than 50 German tanks for the loss of fewer than 20 Shermans. The German crews, many of whom were newly trained replacements rushed from depots, were shocked by the effectiveness of American fire. Intelligence reports captured after the battle revealed their confusion. Enemy tanks appeared to have new ammunition capable of piercing Panther armor at great distance. At the height of the battle on September 22nd, the fog lifted just enough for U.S. spotter aircraft to locate enemy concentrations. American artillery blanketed the German assembly areas, forcing Panthers to advance piecemeal. Sherman crews lay in wait, engines idling, their gunners ready with VAP rounds chambered. One by one, as the silhouettes of German tanks emerged through the haze, American gunners fired. The VAP projectiles struck with uncanny precision, punching through turrets and holes that had once seemed invincible. Lieutenant Colonel Abrams coordinated his battalion with remarkable efficiency. Using fast communication and aggressive maneuvering, he turned the numerical disadvantage into a tactical trap. The Shermans moved in pairs, one drawing fire while the other flanked and fired VAP into the Panthers' sides. Reports from the field tell of tank duels lasting mere seconds. The first to fire often determined the outcome. The statistics were staggering. In less than 2 weeks, the 4th Armored Division destroyed or disabled over 250 German tanks and assault guns while suffering comparatively light losses. The Battle of Arracourt was a decisive victory for the U.S. Army and a devastating blow to German hopes of regaining the initiative in Lorraine. For the first time, Allied tankers no longer saw the Panther as an unstoppable monster, but as a target that could be defeated with precision and courage. Yet, beyond the tactics and numbers, the psychological impact was even greater. For months, American tank crews had fought with the knowledge that their weapons were inferior. The introduction of the M93 HVAP changed that dynamic overnight. In interviews conducted after the war, Many veterans described the battle as a turning point in morale. One tank gunner from the 35th Tank Battalion put it simply, "We stopped running from Panthers at Arracourt. We started hunting them." The German reaction was swift but futile. Reports to Berlin blamed poor weather, inexperienced crews, and the loss of air superiority. Few acknowledged the growing technological gap in ammunition. German industry could no longer produce enough tungsten for their own APCR rounds, and Allied interdiction of supply routes from Spain and Portugal made replenishment impossible. As American production of HVAP rounds increased, the tide of armored warfare began to shift decisively. On the ground, Sherman crews began marking their tanks with small chalk symbols after confirmed kills, not out of vanity, but as proof that their machines could now stand toe-to-toe with Germany's best. The legend of Arracourt spread rapidly through the ranks. In training camps back in England, instructors used it as a case study in maneuver warfare and combined arms coordination. The message was clear: technology and tactics together could overcome any enemy. After the battle, General Patton himself visited the front to congratulate Abrams and his men. He reportedly told Abrams, "You have made history here." This will be studied for generations. Patton understood that Arracourt was more than a victory. It was a demonstration of how adaptation and innovation could rewrite the rules of war. The HVAP round, though small in size, had reshaped the battlefield in the Allies' favor. As autumn deepened and the Third Army pressed toward the German border, the lessons of Arracourt became doctrine. Tank crews were trained to conserve their HVAP rounds for high-value targets and to coordinate more closely with infantry and reconnaissance units. The success of the M93 also spurred further research into post-war armor-piercing designs, including discarding sabot rounds that would dominate tank warfare in later decades. The Battle of Arracourt remains a testament to the power of innovation under pressure. It was a clash defined not just by machines, but by minds, the engineers who forged the tools, the commanders who used them, and the soldiers who trusted them. The Sherman tank, once seen as outdated and underpowered, had reclaimed its place as a symbol of American ingenuity and resilience. As the smoke cleared over Lorraine and the last echoes of cannon fire faded, the fields around Arracourt were littered with the burned-out hulks of Panther tanks, grim monuments to a changing era in mechanized warfare. The HVAP round had done more than pierce armor. It had pierced the myth of German invincibility. By the closing months of 1944, Europe was scarred by nearly 6 years of relentless conflict. The Allies were pushing eastward, and Germany was fighting with its back against the wall. Yet the war was no longer only about territory or machines. It had become a war of the mind. In this psychological battlefield, the M93 high-velocity armor-piercing round had already achieved something beyond its physical design. It had altered perception, confidence, and the very spirit of armored warfare. In the aftermath of Arracourt, American tank crews carried themselves differently. The air of resignation that had hung over them for much of 1943 and early 1944 was replaced with determination. Crews now approached the battlefield with the knowledge that their shots could count, that their machines could win. This shift in morale was evident in letters sent home, in after-action reports, and in the words of General George S. Patton himself, who declared, "The best tank is the one that can shoot first and keep shooting." The M93 HVAP had made that philosophy real. On the German side, the psychological reversal was equally profound. For years, the Wehrmacht had relied on its armor as both weapon and symbol, the embodiment of technological superiority. German tankers had grown accustomed to dominating Allied counterparts, their Panthers and Tigers serving not only as battlefield instruments, but as morale boosters. At Arracourt, that illusion shattered. Reports from German commanders described the growing unease among Panzer crews who could no longer depend on their armor's invulnerability. One Panther gunner wrote in his diary, "The Americans fire new shells. They come fast, they go through everything. It is no longer safe to stay and fight." This transformation extended beyond individual engagements. By late 1944, Allied intelligence had intercepted German communications that revealed increasing caution in their use of heavy armor. Tank formations that had once advanced boldly now avoided direct confrontation with American units known to be equipped with 76mm guns. The introduction of the M93 HVAP had forced a strategic rethink within the German high command. Instead of mass tank assaults, they began to rely more heavily on ambush tactics, terrain advantage, and defensive positions, a sign that the psychological balance of armored warfare had shifted. The morale of American tankers grew even stronger as news of Arracourt spread. In training camps in England, Italy, and even as far away as the Pacific, tank instructors began using the battle as a lesson in adaptability. Manuals and training films produced by the U.S. Army's Armored Force emphasized the importance of coordination, communication, and confidence in new technology. When properly armed and properly used, one instructional film proclaimed, "The Sherman tank can meet and defeat the finest enemy armor." That statement, once an optimistic claim, was now grounded in hard-won truth. The psychological impact was also deeply personal. Many American tankers who had survived earlier defeats found redemption through the HVAP's success. Sergeant Herbert Buffum of the 4th Armored Division wrote, "After the war, for months, we lived with fear. You knew that when a Tiger appeared, your only hope was to flank and pray. After we got HVAP, everything changed. You could finally fight back, really fight back." His words capture what numbers and charts cannot: the liberation of the human spirit that comes when innovation restores faith in survival. The HVAP's influence also extended into tactics and doctrine. Commanders encouraged tank crews to use HVAP rounds selectively, saving them for the heaviest targets while relying on standard armor-piercing and high-explosive shells for other threats. Supply officers worked to ensure that frontline units received at least a limited stock, though shortages persisted due to the rarity of tungsten. Tank battalions often carried their HVAP rounds in small, carefully guarded boxes, each one a prized asset that might determine the outcome of a battle. The Germans, aware of their dwindling tungsten reserves, attempted to compensate through other means. Engineers developed new variants of shaped charge weapons, such as the Panzerfaust and Panzerschreck, to counter Allied armor. These handheld weapons were deadly at close range, but they could not replace the long-range dominance once held by the Panthers and Tigers. The HVAP had effectively neutralized the psychological advantage of German armor, and with it, the aura of invincibility that had once fueled their panzer divisions. By the time of the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, the U.S. Army had incorporated HVAP rounds into many of its armored divisions. Although supply was still limited, those who had them used them to devastating effect against German tanks caught in the Ardennes. Tank engagements during the counteroffensive demonstrated that the days of Allied inferiority were over. Even under the harsh winter conditions, Sherman crews used their speed, communication, and newfound firepower to outmaneuver and destroy enemy armor. The battle proved that the lessons of Arracourt had been learned well, yet the HVAP's significance extended beyond victory on the battlefield. It marked a fundamental change in the philosophy of warfare. The lesson was clear: superiority in combat was no longer defined solely by the thickness of armor or the size of a gun. It was defined by the ability to innovate, to adapt, and to bring science to the service of survival. The M93 HVAP had embodied that spirit, an intersection of metallurgy, engineering, and human courage. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the Sherman tank remained a symbol of American resilience. More than 49,000 had been built, serving across every theater of war. The M93 HVAP, though produced in relatively small numbers, had left an outsized impact. Its development paved the way for post-war advancements in kinetic energy penetrators and armor design. The idea of using dense, high-velocity cores would inspire the armor-piercing discarding sabot APTs and armor-piercing fin-stabilized discarding sabot APFSDS rounds that became standard in later generations of tanks, from the M48 Patton to the M1 Abrams. In the years that followed, military historians and analysts would look back on 1944 as a turning point in the evolution of armored warfare. The Sherman's rise from underdog to contender was not just a story of technology, but of belief in the capacity of science to overcome adversity. The HVAP was proof that in modern warfare, innovation could tilt the scales as decisively as numbers or firepower. The psychological war had been won not merely on the battlefield, but in the minds of those who fought. German tankers no longer felt untouchable. American crews no longer felt doomed. The balance of fear had shifted, and with it, the course of armored combat for decades to come. As historians such as Hugh M. Cole and Rick Atkinson later wrote in their detailed accounts of the Lorraine campaign, the victory at Arracourt was not just a triumph of tactics, but a testament to the fusion of engineering and courage. It demonstrated that in war, adaptation was the ultimate weapon. The legacy of the M93 HVAP endures. It was a round born of desperation, perfected through science, and proven through sacrifice. Its tungsten heart symbolized the determination of those who refused to accept defeat. In the end, it was not merely a bullet that pierced armor, it was an idea that pierced history. And so, when historians speak of the evolution of tank warfare, of the transformation from iron giants to modern steel predators, they remember 1944, the year the Shermans fought back, the year the HVAP round changed the rules of war.